who'd built an empire while he'd been too blind to see past her empty womb. And now his mother's survival depended on the mercy of the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. He'd chosen fertility over fortune, but the mistress carrying his child knew nothing of the debt collector circling his failing business. While his ex-wife held both his mother's medical files and the mortgage to his company in her perfectly manicured hands, the hospital hummed with her authority as she reviewed his mother's critical condition. But revenge wasn't just about denying care. It was about letting him discover piece by devastating piece that the barren woman he'd mocked was actually the silent partner who'd funded his entire career, and now she was ready to collect. Would his pregnant mistress stand by him when the bankruptcy notices arrived? Would his mother survive long enough to learn her son had destroyed the one woman who could save her? And would he finally understand that infertility was never the weakness his greed, his betrayal, and his devastating blindness were? The divorce papers had been signed on a Tuesday, but David Mitchell remembered it as the day he'd finally chosen his future over his past. His wife of 7 years had sat across from him in the lawyer's office with dry eyes and a calm expression that had unsettled him more than tears would have. But he'd pushed that discomfort aside because Jessica was 4 months pregnant and glowing with the promise he'd always wanted. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped paying attention years ago, was that the woman signing those papers controlled 43% of Mitchell Medical Supplies, the company his grandfather had founded, and that he now ran into the ground with quarterly losses he blamed on market conditions. She'd bought those shares through shell companies while he'd been busy explaining to friends that his wife's inability to conceive was destroying their marriage. But Emma Hartley had learned long ago that men like David only saw what they wanted to see. 6 months after the divorce, David stood in St. Augustine Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit, watching his mother struggle for each breath through a ventilator. Margaret Mitchell had collapsed at her garden club meeting, but the stroke had been massive and the prognosis grim. The neurologist had used words like minimal brain activity and quality of life decisions, but David had insisted on every possible intervention because that's what sons did. They fought for their mothers even when the bills were piling up like snow in a blizzard. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to discuss your account balance," the hospital administrator said, appearing at his elbow with a tablet that glowed with numbers David didn't want to see. "Your mother's care has exceeded your insurance coverage, and we require payment arrangements for continued treatment." David's jaw tightened because Jessica was at home with their newborn daughter, and his company had just lost its biggest supplier contract, but he couldn't let his mother die over money. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. The administrator nodded with professional sympathy, but his eyes held something else, a knowing quality that made David's skin prickle. "The hospital board will be reviewing high balance cases next week. I'd recommend securing payment before then." What David didn't understand was that the hospital board had only one person who mattered, and she'd been waiting for this moment since the day he told her that a real woman would have given me children by now. The story of Emma Hartley's rise was one David had never bothered to learn, but it had begun long before their marriage in the research labs of Johns Hopkins, where she'd developed a revolutionary drug delivery system at 23. She'd been a prodigy who saw patterns in molecular structures the way musicians heard symphonies in silence. Her professors had warned her that brilliance without connections would only take her so far in the pharmaceutical world. She'd met David at a medical supply conference where his family's company was exhibiting outdated equipment with impressive marketing. But his charm had been undeniable, the way he'd listened to her ideas about improving surgical tools, the way he'd made her feel seen in a world that often overlooked women in science. They'd married after a whirlwind courtship, but the romance had curdled the moment her first pregnancy test came back negative, then the second, then 20th. "My mother wants grandchildren," David had said after year 3, as if Emma's body was a malfunctioning appliance. "Maybe we should see a specialist." They'd seen 17 specialists, but the diagnosis had always been the same: unexplained infertility, a medical mystery that Emma's brilliant mind couldn't solve for herself. David's resentment had grown with each failed cycle. But Emma had poured her grief into her work, patenting 3 more medical devices and licensing them through companies David never connected to his wife because she'd used her maiden name professionally. When Jessica had appeared at Mitchell Medical Supplies as a sales representative, with red hair and easy laughter, Emma had seen the end coming like a diagnosis written in bold print. David's late nights at the office had multiplied, but his company's numbers had continued to decline because he'd been too distracted to notice that his new sales rep was selling nothing while costing him everything. "I'm in love with someone else," David had finally admitted, but his eyes had been defiant rather than apologetic. "Jessica's pregnant. She's giving me what you never could." Emma had felt something break inside her that wasn't her heart, but rather the last thread of mercy she'd been holding for the man she'd once believed she loved. "I hope you'll be very happy," she'd said, and she'd meant it the way a surgeon means this won't hurt, a comforting lie before the cutting begins. The shell companies had been easy to establish for someone with Emma's resources and intelligence, but taking control of St. Augustine Memorial had required 3 years of strategic stock purchases and board manipulation. She'd become the hospital's primary shareholder while David had been busy playing house with Jessica and their baby. But Emma had been patient because revenge rushed. Was revenge wasted?